Placed in between four continents, the Atlantic Ocean is one of the largest nautical domains on Earth. It has served as a conduit for celebrated explorers and as a laboratory for groundbreaking infrastructure projects. Still more, beyond physical attributes, the Atlantic symbolizes the bond between Americans and Europeans through institutions like NATO. On the whole, the Atlantic has played an exceptional part in shaping the modern world through exploration, commerce, colonization, and cultural exchange. Its influence continues to be felt in various aspects of contemporary global societies, often dubbed as Atlanticism or Western liberalism. Just as the classical world was built around the Mediterranean, the modern world was built around the Atlantic. However, the times are changing. The Pacific is turning the tide, and with that change in power distribution comes the privilege to redraw the world map as one sees fit. This rearrangement affects communities worldwide. Underneath the oceans are submarine cables that provide seamless internet traffic across the globe. However, the internet can be a dangerous place, which is why we've partnered with NordVPN, today's sponsor. NordVPN is in the business of protecting you online. A VPN is a tool that allows you to connect to the internet through a country of your choice. I use it whenever I try to access local sources that are not available in my region for research purposes. But that's not an everyday use for VPNs. Most people use VPNs when they are abroad and want to connect to the internet from their own country so they don't get kicked out of sensitive apps like Gmail or their social media accounts. Sometimes I will connect via the United States just to get access to American content in my streaming services that aren't available here. However, people mostly use NordVPN to protect their online activity. It's not just a VPN anymore. It is now a threat protection tool that allows you to block malware, to block intrusive ads, and to generally give you safety with your data as you surf the web. They also continue to come out with new products, like the password manager called NordPass, where you can have all your passwords securely stored in this one tool. The internet is a wonderful place, but it can also be dangerous, increasingly so. And that is why NordVPN exists, to protect you while you're browsing the web. There is a link in my description. It is nordvpn.com/CaspianReport. When you click the link, it helps support the channel. It also gets you 2 years of NordVPN plus 4 extra months. You can try it out. If you're not satisfied within 30 days, you get all your money back. It's a good deal, and again, it helps support the channel when you sign up. Thank you NordVPN for sponsoring today's video and supporting our content. Now, let's get back to this fascinating story, and it all starts here. This is the Atlantic. Measured at roughly 85 million square kilometers, it borders the glacial Arctic Ocean to the north, the Pacific to the southwest, and the Indian Ocean to the southeast. Overall, the Atlantic has over a dozen subdivisions, including the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Labrador Sea, the Sargasso Sea, the Caribbean Sea, and so on. Some of these bodies of water are separated by land, others by circulating surface currents. The Atlantic also sits at the junction of numerous tectonic plates. As a result of the seismic activity, the ocean expands in size every year, moving Europe and Africa away from North and South America by a few centimeters annually. The Atlantic is thus in constant motion, both on the surface and underneath. The sea itself is crossed by several cold and warm currents that influence the climates of the surrounding continents. The most notable is the Gulf Stream, a warm ocean current that begins in the Straits of Florida before traveling over 6,000 kilometers to reach the European coasts. It provides the continent with a temperate climate, making Europe more habitable than other places. Climate change, however, places many of the ocean currents at risk. If the worst comes to pass, the Gulf Stream could change course and end up somewhere else. Either way, these warm currents contribute to the ocean's rich biodiversity, supporting a wide array of marine life, including approximately 1,100 species of fish. This biodiversity has become a distinct source of protein for many nations. In the here and now, the Atlantic Ocean ranks as the world's second largest fishing zone, accounting for a quarter of the global fishing activity, although still far behind the Pacific, which accounts for more than half of the worldwide total. Unfortunately though, increased fishing and consumption have led to the decline of certain species, including cod, salmon, and pollock. Moreover, overfishing is exacerbated by the extensive pollution of the Atlantic due to plastic waste. For decades, litter and other debris have been piling up in parts of the ocean. Much of this waste rests along the Mediterranean coastline. Additionally, there are two massive whirlpools of waste, one situated between the American coast and Western Africa, and the other between South Africa and the shores of Brazil. There are efforts to clean up and reduce the growth of these waste whirlpools, but the scale and nature of the currents make it difficult. Meanwhile, from a historical viewpoint, the Atlantic is steeped in discovery. Generations of explorers have ventured into its corners, starting with the Vikings in the 10th century. Eric the Red had founded the first colony in Greenland and used that as a stepping stone to sail across the northern Atlantic. After a decade of exploration, Eric made a historic discovery that would eventually become North America. His crew traveled the coast of Labrador and established a colony at Meadows Cove, which is now part of modern-day Newfoundland, Canada. It's believed that the Vikings continued further south, tracing the St. Lawrence River and following the shoreline until they reached areas that are now part of the northeastern United States. However, this is where the Viking exploration stopped. The climate had started breaking down in the 13th century, and up to that point, there was stiff resistance from the native population. Atlantic exploration picked up steam again in the late 15th century. Three new revolutionary inventions changed the way humankind sailed the seas: the caravel, the compass, and portolan charts. These innovations gave European sailors the tools, confidence, and opportunity to depart from their homelands and undertake ambitious voyages into the unknown. Most of these voyages were sponsored by the two great naval kingdoms at the time, Spain and Portugal. The Spanish made it first. Led by Christopher Columbus, Spain made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, which opened the door for the colonization of Central and North America. Portugal didn't sit by idly though. A few years later, on behalf of the Portuguese, Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived in Brazil and then proceeded to Africa, where he established outposts along the coastlines. By employing these positions, Portugal designed a new route that navigated around the Cape of Good Hope to reach South and East Asia. Once the Europeans could exit and enter the Atlantic, previously isolated communities were drawn into interlocking political, economic, and military systems. It was a major step towards globalized communication and commerce. However, as soon as these discoveries were made, Spain and Portugal sought to monopolize their gains by signing the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Essentially, a massive vertical line was drawn through the entire Atlantic Ocean and split between the two Iberian kingdoms. Everything west of the line belonged to Spain, and everything to the east was for Portugal. It seemed like a good plan at the time, but the thing about lines on a map is that they are inconsequential as long as there is no real means to enforce them. France, Britain, and the Netherlands rejected the Spanish-Portuguese arrangement and commenced their own voyages across the Atlantic. This period is commonly referred to as the Age of Discovery. It ended with virtually the entire Americas being colonized by European powers in later centuries. The driving force behind this complicated and taxing expansion was simple: an insatiable hunger for hard income. Money, after all, was needed to support the massive standing armies in Europe, which they had maintained from the late Middle Ages onwards. Costly arms races followed, and the European nations fought for the right to plunder and colonize. But the New World had plenty to go around. Portugal and Spain focused on colonizing the Caribbean and South America. They exploited the rivalries within the local battle spaces to serve their own needs. Spain took advantage of a series of civil wars within the Inca and Aztec empires and overthrew the native hegemons. Portugal employed local allies to do the actual fighting and then disposed of them later. Gradually, Spanish and Portuguese control extended over the continent, and a new elite with both European and American ancestry soon began to take shape. Meanwhile, the British and French focused on capturing North America. Here, in the north, the situation was different. Instead of centralized kingdoms, patchworks of loose coalitions and tribes ruled the land. By the time the British and the French made contact, these loose native coalitions had no coercive authority. There were no powerful rulers who could negotiate or accept defeat on behalf of their nations. Thus, as British and French colonies steadily expanded, the native tribes had no choice but to retreat into the interior. So, rather than a quick death, the native population in North America underwent a slow, painful demise. Either way, in both South and North America, the period of colonization witnessed one of the highest rates of violence on the planet. By the 16th century, the European powers were engaging one another in vicious naval battles for the supremacy of maritime trade and the conquest of new territories. At the same time, the Atlantic steadily evolved into a major commercial hub for the trade of raw materials, manufactured goods, and, yes, slavery. So there was plenty to plunder and rob. But the interaction between the New World and the Old World was more than just physical. It included the exchange of ideas and cultures. In particular, the Columbian Exchange was a period of biological and cultural trade between the Americas and Europe. New foods like maize, potatoes, and tobacco were introduced to Europe, while wheat, coffee, and sugarcane gained access to the Americas. This exchange had a profound impact on global agriculture, diets, and economies. Still more, the transatlantic slave trade proliferated. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas as slaves. This brutal trade had a lasting effect on the demographics, cultures, and societies of the Americas, particularly in the United States and Brazil. Overall, the triangular transaction between Europe, Africa, and the Americas contributed significantly to the growth of global commerce and laid the foundation for modern international trade networks. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Atlantic Ocean was one of the primary avenues for European prosperity. The circulation of wealth allowed the Europeans to fund, build, and develop their colonial holdings in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Keeping these colonies neatly organized and working around the clock taxed the centralized European governments with ever-increasing responsibilities. As a result, new legal systems were established, new languages merged, and new cultures developed over time. Some of the colonies in the Americas grew distinctly different identities, and this communal experience would have far-reaching consequences for the modern world, reshaping geopolitics to this day. Roughly at the same time, in 1823, the United States declared the Monroe Doctrine, which claimed the Western Hemisphere as part of its backyard. From this time on, the power dynamics between the two halves of the Atlantic changed. American gunboat diplomacy kept the Europeans out of places like Cuba, Haiti, Panama, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic. Consequently, European influence steadily declined in North and South America. Stemming from this, Europe turned its gaze on Africa. By the 19th century, innovations in transportation and weaponry made it possible to venture deeply into Africa and conquer the continent of plenty, a period known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium rapidly established control over various parts of Africa. By and large, they were driven by economic interests, national prestige, and strategic advantages. Africa, however, changed profoundly. Its socio-political ecosystem would never be the same again. Likewise, new innovations in shipping accelerated transatlantic trade. With the invention of steamboats, one could travel from London to New York in just 15 days. And many did just that. Millions of Europeans migrated to the Americas with a particular focus on the United States. The merging of societies fostered new cultures, languages, and ideas. A tapestry of diverse communities developed in the Americas, Europe, and Africa, and this exchange would have a lasting impact on art, music, literature, and cuisine. The population of the United States jumped, even surpassing that of the European countries. In the time being, to cope with the massive movements of people and goods, the ports in Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, Felixstowe, New York, Miami, San Juan all underwent spectacular growth. Meanwhile, increased capacity in shipping and cargo led to even greater commercial avenues, more so than before. Global trade intensified, so much so that new canals were built to expedite the flow of goods. In the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal did away with the lengthy journey around the Cape of Good Hope, while the Panama Canal made the passage around the Cape Horn obsolete. By employing these two canals, the northern Atlantic was now directly tied to both the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Still later, in the early 20th century, the invention of the airplane enabled transatlantic flights. Traveling from one end of the ocean to the other became faster and more affordable. Charles Lindbergh was the first to make a non-stop solo transatlantic flight in 1927. It took him roughly 33 hours and 30 minutes to fly from New York to Paris. At the time, naval vessels took about 2 weeks to complete the journey, so Lindbergh's flight was a game changer. Steadily, but assuredly, air routes replaced maritime routes, which again boosted cultural and commercial exchanges between both sides of the ocean. Air travel became so common that North America and Europe developed a special kinship called Atlanticism. Economic, diplomatic, cultural, and security ties were synchronized. An unspoken territorial continuity developed between Europe and North America centered around liberal Western concepts. European and American control over the entire Atlantic geographical area transformed the Western powers into global hegemons. The geopolitics of both continents merged. What happened in Europe affected the well-being of the United States and vice versa. Not once, but twice, American boots made landfall in Europe to fight for their interests and that of their allies. During World War II, the northern half of the Atlantic Ocean became a battleground that would decide the new global order. The Germans used submarines and destroyers to control the flow of weapons, soldiers, and provisions from America to Europe. Even after hostilities ceased, the struggle for Atlantic supremacy resulted in the creation of institutional alliances and structures like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and many more. These institutions were designed with legal regulations at heart, with the purpose being to promote stability, prosperity, and security. This had never happened before in world history, and playing by the rules was, at times, not easy nor practical. Nevertheless, the formation of these Atlantic institutions laid the groundwork for what is now known as international law, a set of universal agreements and rules that oversee interactions between countries. Following the conclusion of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as the new enemy of the liberal Western Bloc. So, the nations adjacent to the Northern Atlantic formed a military pact to monitor and control the reach of the Soviet Union. In 1949, that pact took on the name North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. Their mission was to establish a collective defense apparatus against the threat posed by the Soviets. NATO proved to be indispensable during the Cold War. New submarine bases and air bases were established in Denmark, Germany, Italy, and Turkey to detect the movement of Soviet weaponry in the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Baltic Sea. Through their collective efforts, NATO kept the Soviet Union in a firm grip. Eventually, though, in 1989, the Soviet Union began collapsing from within. NATO, as a parallel organization, lost its meaning. Defense budgets dropped, and a long peace ensued in Europe. Many of the former communist nations in Central and Eastern Europe switched sides and joined NATO instead. It can take decades for nations to wake up to new geopolitical realities on the ground. For Europe, that call came in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine's Crimea region. Steadily, NATO regained its lost importance, its primary purpose. Fast forward to the present, and NATO now boasts 32 member states. Finland joined as recently as 2023 and Sweden joined in 2024. Simultaneously, across the ocean floor, there are underwater cables that carry data between North America and Europe. These submarine cables were first laid in the 20th century and have since expanded in scope. In a nutshell, these cables are vital to the territorial continuity between Europe and North America and contemporary liberal Atlanticism. Overall, though, the Atlantic has steadily lost ground to another ocean that is even larger, the Pacific. Atlantic trade falls short when compared to the Pacific. Japan, India, South Korea, China, and others have claimed their market shares in favor of Asia. Accordingly, the distribution of political, economic, and diplomatic weight has shifted more and more in the Pacific's endorsement and is likely to continue in the foreseeable future. China is perceived to be the new 21st century threat to the Western Bloc. The South China Sea, in particular, is a place of heated dispute and conflict. The Americans are pushing to strengthen their foothold in the nearby regions in a strategic doctrine called the pivot to Asia. However, this pivot may come at the expense of the Atlantic Ocean, which is running its course as the center stage for global politics. As events unfold and the Pacific matures, it's clear as the horizon at sea. The old world is dying, and the new world is struggling to be born. So now is the time for Leviathans. I've been your host Shirvan from CaspianReport. If you approve of what we do, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and mayhaps share the video. In any case, thank you for your time, and Sawal.